Well, I'd like to welcome you to Crash Test Chess. Try saying that 10 times very quickly and you won't be able to talk for the next week. So this DVD is a very quick and in-your-face DVD which is going to look at some very critical and short games to try to get you thinking really like a grandmaster. So I'm going to try to get you into the way I think when I'm playing, and hopefully that will improve your standard of chess. So what I've done, I've picked a couple of games. We're going to go over. The first game we're going to look at is a game I had against Korchnoi with the black pieces from the Swiss Championship. So Korchnoi is a bit of a legend, a great player. I actually managed to win this game, so I'm going to go through my thought processes over the game. It's only about 30 moves long, so hopefully by analysing what I was thinking and with this in-your-face kind of attitude we're going to have at this game, we're going to learn, and hopefully we're going to give you some good tips that you can use in your own games. So let's move straight into the game. So I was black. Korchnoi played his famous d4 move on move 1, and I'm famous for playing the Dutch defence, but I thought against Korchnoi I tried the King's Indian defence. Now it's very important when you're playing chess to try to, before the game, think about your opponent and what style of play your opponent chooses, because the battle begins really in chess before the game has, before the first move's been played. So, I mean, in general, I know this is maybe a bit of a stereotype kind of thing, but stereotypes do work in chess. If you're playing an older gentleman, this doesn't go for Korchnoi, by the way, necessarily, because he's amazing at tactics and everything, but generally, if you're playing an older player, they prefer very stable positional games where there's not a lot of action going on. So I really wanted to try to create a very sharp opening battle and a tactical battle, because I thought that was my best way of defeating Korchnoi. So that's why I chose the King's Indian defence, in the hope of a very sharp battle. I needed to win this as well, because I was a point behind Korchnoi to catch him up in the standing of the tournament. So that's why I chose the King's Indian defence with knight to f6. Korchnoi is a very principled player, so he played a very standard setup with c4. So g6, knight to c3 was played, bishop to g7, and e4. So he goes for the standard large centre build-up. Now, the King's Indian defence is what they call a hyper-modern opening, and it's been favoured by some of the most dynamic and top players in the world. Now, the idea of the King's Indian defence is really to attack a white's centre, and so eventually you can try to get the plan of e5 in, with f5 to come later to gain space to attack on the king's side. But you do lose a lot of space, and it's very important actually when you're playing chess to be very comfortable with the openings you play. I mean, I've taught a lot of people in my life, and one of the key things is to pick an opening that suits your style. So if you're not very happy in cramped positions, then this would be an awful opening to choose, because King's Indian, you do get a rather cramped position. So very important, I think rule number 1 would really be pick openings that suit your style. Pick openings that you're comfortable playing. And another bit of advice I'd say, especially if you're starting off in chess, is to pick openings that you're comfortable playing, but also don't change your openings. I've taught so many players who play about 5 different openings against one d4, and there's an old saying is that it's better to be a master of one trade rather than have no real knowledge of a number of trades. So if you pick one opening, you'll understand the opening very well, and you'll also get to know the middle game positions. So I really only played the King's Indian defence and the Dutch. So okay, I played the Dutch up to the age of 20, but I understand the middle game positions and even the end game positions very well. So another bit of advice, pick openings and choose that opening and stay with that opening as long as you're comfortable with it, obviously, but don't play a number of different openings because you'll never master them. So after the move e4, I now continue d6, a standard play. Korchnoi now played the classical variation with knight to f3, which is the most popular way of playing against the King's Indian. The knight is very well placed on f3. I castled, and now Korchnoi has played a number of moves here against some of the best players in the world, obviously. I mean, he's Korchnoi, so everyone knows how many good players he's played. And here Korchnoi played h3, which I've seen him play a couple of times before, but this is kind of a prophylactic move. And also in some positions, as I mentioned before, black's setup or aim is to play some idea of e5 and f5 later on. This move f5, even though you won't be able to see it necessarily in this position, is a key way to start an attack. And in some positions, Korchnoi wants to play g4 to aim against this move f5. So already opening battle has started here. Korchnoi's maybe preparing against f5 in certain positions, and in the meantime I've got to try to find some active play in the position. Another rule I say, if you've got a cramped position, I don't like ever defending passively, and in this series of DVDs, Crash Test Chess, we're going to try and look for the most interesting active solutions, and I really want to get you to play actively and aggressively as possible in your games, because I'm sure this will help your standard of play improve drastically. So after the move h3, we've got to look for an active way to do something in the centre. So here I decided to play e5, and this is one of the standard breaks in the King's Indian defence. And there are a number of tactics. So what happens if white captures on e5 twice? But the problem with this move is that black nearly always has a knight takes e4 at the end, and the bishop will be able to capture white's knight on e5. Now, the standard way of meeting this move e5 is by playing d5. And Korchnoi is a very classical player who believes in the space advantage. So by playing d5, the position is now locked up. So when you have you enter a closed position like this, when the pawn structure all of a sudden becomes locked up, as it does here, you've got to think of ways to create pawn breaks or counterplay. Now, there are a number of pawn breaks in this position that spring to mind. Like I mentioned before, f5 is one pawn break. Another pawn break that black can try is c6. So this is the kind of thing that I'll be going for. White does have more space, especially on the queen side. So white's pawn break is going to be something to do with c5 at some point. So already you've got to try to look, when the structure changes, you've got to try to notice these changes and adapt to them. So every time the structure changes, note in your head, right, there's a change in structure, so now I've got to think how I'm going to play against this change in structure. So here I was looking at trying to play the move f5 at some point, but first of all I wanted to slow down my opponent's plan of playing b4 and c5 and develop some of my queenside pieces. So as b4 is an idea, how do we stop b4? Well, the move a5 sprung to mind, so a very logical move, a5. Korchnoi now continue with bishop to g5. So there's a number of options here again. I believe a move like queen to e8 is possible. The one reasoning behind bishop to g5 is that, again, it's this battle of f5 is going to come into play, and I can't play f5 if my knight on f6 is there. And now I can't move my knight on f6 away because I lose my queen. So again, it's very logical thinking. Each move is really a battle already, just from the outset. So I could consider playing something like queen to e8 in order to move my knight and then play f5. But I decided to play h6 because it was the most aggressive option, and it forced my opponent to make a decision straight away. Now, h6 can be a weakness in some positions, but again, I'm going for aggressive chess, quick attacking chess, and I want to force the issue. So this is why I chose to move h6. So now Korchnoi drops his bishop back to e3. Bishop to e3, good square for the bishop again, because maybe c5 is this plan he wants to play. So another rule I'd say you've got to do, whenever your opponent plays a move, always look at the piece he's just moved and see what his new plan is. This is one thing that a lot of beginners just don't do. I'm amazed when I go over some of my pupils' games, when their opponent moves a piece, I always ask him, why did they move that piece? You should, before you think of your own moves, always look at your opponent's moves first, because then you can try to get in your opponent's head and stop your opponent's plans or find a good way to counter them. So c5 is the plan here. So in this position, I stop this plan by going a knight to a6, taking control of c5, and potentially my knight can either come to c5 or even b4 at a later point, so developing a piece. Knight to a6, Korchnoi developed his other bishop, bishop to d3, and now I went for one of the pawn breaks I mentioned earlier, pawn to c6, to try to create maybe some counterplay on the queen side. So Korchnoi now played queen to d2, hitting my pawn on h6. As I mentioned before, this is a slight weakness, so I've got to deal with this idea. Now g5 is positionally wrong here for a number of reasons. Reason number one is actually that if I go f5 later on, which again is a key break in the King's Indian defence, I won't be able to capture now back on f5 with my pawn because I moved it. So I've created a lot of weaknesses on my light squares around my king. I've lost a lot of dynamism in the position because I can't go f5 anymore. I've also created a target. Maybe Korchnoi could even consider going h4 in this position to try to attack my king side. So this would be a big mistake. So a standard way of meeting this setup, queen d2, bishop to e3, is by playing king to h7. Precisely what I played here. Korchnoi castled. can't be a bad move. And now I decided to exchange on d5. So c takes d5. C takes d5 is now played, and again we have a change in structure. So like I mentioned before, every time you have a change in structure, it's a very good idea to have a rethink about the pros and cons of the position. Now, change in structures happen because the C pawns have been exchanged, so this could benefit both sides. When you've got an open file, try to get your rooks on the open file. Very simple play. So if white can try double rooks on the C file, get a rook to maybe c7 later on, this would be quite a strong plan from white. But potentially I can also get a rook to c8 and maybe continue a knight to c5. So it's got its pros and cons of exchanging on this c file. I mean, it gives more options. I'm going for aggressive chess, dynamic chess. So this idea is to basically keep my options open here. So now, what other break is critical in this position? Well, you should know now the centre's been blocked up, so I need to create some counterplay. White has more space on the queen side. Another general rule is you shouldn't play on the side of the board you're weakest on. Now, actually, I'm weakest on the queen side here because white's got more space on the queen side due to his strong pawn on d5. So generally, I shouldn't actually be playing on the queen side. I should be looking at other areas to play on. And kingside play is what I'm going for here. So I would need to move my knight away to create the f5 break. So I went knight to d7. So I'm getting ready to play f5. And also now my knight can potentially come to c5, so which is a pretty decent square. Simple plan I've got is to go f5, f4, and then push my g pawn up the board. So this is one way I could actually create a lot of play on the king's side. Okay, so knight d7 was played, and my opponent Korchnoi now playing knight to h2. To meet f5 potentially with f3 to keep his pawn structure intact. I now move my knight to c5 so we can see my pieces are coming to life. I always think of the most active square for your pieces, and here I like my knight on c5. It looked pretty active on this square, and it also opens up my light square bishop now. So knight on dc5, very logical continuation. Korchnoi wanted to keep his bishops. Like I said, he's a very classical player, and he believed that bishops are stronger than knights. So bishop to c2, keeping his bishop on that square. And now I broke out with this idea, f5, create play on the area of the board I'm strongest on, and that is the king side. That's the area of the board, so f5 is a logical way to continue here. And Korchnoi meant this was a standard plan. He doesn't want to let me just bulldozer him on the king side with a move like f4, so he actually played f4 himself. And we see another reason why he's moved his knight to h2. So a lot of this is prophylactic thinking, which is a key thing in chess. You also have to think of your opponent's moves, and you have to think, well, what's his plan? And again, Korchnoi saw, when I moved my knight to d7, my plan was to play f5. So he thought, right, how am I going to meet this plan f5? I don't want to go f5, f4, hence why I played knight to h2. So it's a bit like ping pong. You've got to always continue it in chess. Think about your opponent's plans, stop your opponent's plans while you're trying to keep bulldozing your own plans through, as long as they're good plans, of course. But by experience, you should know what are good plans and what are bad plans. So f4 was played. So I decided to take on f4, opening up my basically bishop, King's Indian bishop. I think Goofield, who was a very entertaining author and generally entertaining person, called this bishop the Goofield bishop. Now, I think that's a bit extravagant, but he did have some amazing wins with this bishop on g7, and you often see in the King's Indian this bishop really coming to life later on in the game. So this is one reason I took on this square. My Korchnoi now played rook takes f4, and the top of the rook's just broken off. This is what crash test chess is all about. We're going to move the pieces so much they're going to collapse on us. So it's in your face chess, and there goes a bit of the rook. So thank you for that. Okay, so rook takes f4 was played. And now I decided to take on e4, opening up the f file. Korchnoi now doubled on the f file. So the way I've made this, basically generated this position, is by creating play on the king side where I believed I was strongest. Korchnoi's met my play on the king side by putting his pieces on very sensible squares, but he hasn't had a chance to get his queen side play going. So this is one advantage my position's already got. I'm actually the one who's doing the action here, and it's always nice in chess. That's the way I like playing. I like to be the doer. A lot of people play in different ways, but this basically crash test chess, we're going to try to play actively, and we're going to always look for things to do rather than sit back and not have a plan. I think it's, I mean, one of my philosophies, it's always better to have a bad plan rather than no plan at all. And this is precisely what I'm going for here. I'm not saying it's a bad plan, but I want to be doing the action. I want to be the creator. I want to be forcing the issue. That's what Crash Test Chess is all about. I'm soon not going to be able to say that anymore because my tongue's going to be tied up, but we'll keep going. So rook to f4. So I've got to make a decision now what I do, and it made sense to take on f4. So rook takes f4. Korchnoi continued, rook takes f4 himself. And now I need to look at my pieces that are not taking part in the game. Another rule in chess, when you've got a position you're not sure how to continue, look at your pieces that are not doing anything. And in this position, it's quite clear that my rook on a8 is not doing much. My bishop on c8 is okay because it's on a reasonable diagonal towards white's king. But knights on the rim are very dim, and the knight on a6 is a very dim knight at the moment, so we need to activate this knight. So I'm just using logical ways to improve the positioning of my pieces. So the knight on a6 is not doing anything, so I want to bring it into the game. So knight to b4. And Korchnoi now won his pawn back in the centre by playing bishop takes e4. Okay, he's given up his strong bishop, but he didn't really have much of a choice there. Knight takes e4, so I got rid of this light square bishop, which was on a very good diagonal, towards a weak point on g6. So knight takes e4. Korchnoi continued by knight takes e4. Knights in the centre of the board are very good, so this knight on e4 is generally a very good piece now. And we're coming to a critical moment of the game. We've both played the opening stage quite naturally here, so when you get a middle game position, you really need to start formulating plans. And in this position, well, I still wanted to continue developing my pieces, and the only pieces I don't have developed is really my bishop. So, okay, bishop to f5 is very logical, and now my rook's ready to enter the game, possibly even via c8, and we can see why this move c6 early on was actually quite a useful move. So bishop to f5 was played, and here we enter a very critical moment. Korchnoi actually made maybe the decisive error in this position. If you're in a very active position and both sides, there's pieces flying all over the place. You can see that just by looking at the board. There's a big congregation of pieces in the centre of the board. When you have a position like this, which is actually tactically quite interesting, and both sides have active pieces, you've really got to always look for active solutions. And I never like retreating my pieces. You have to do that sometimes, especially if you're going to reroute them to better squares. But in this position, Korchnoi should have really looked at ways to force me to retreat. And my knight on b4 is a very active piece. So I think after the game, Korchnoi suggested that a3 was a much better move here. And I call this a kick move. And kick moves are very useful, especially if you're a beginner. If your opponent's got an active piece in your side of the board, my knight on b4 is an active piece in white side of the board, then always look at a way to kick this piece away. So you can put it on a worse square. And this is exactly what a3 does. It's a kick move. You're kicking the knight away to a less active square. Now, after this move, a very interesting possibility that I would have been bishop to e5. And this is a very complicated position with a lot of tactics going on. And I know Korchnoi is certainly not scared of any tactics, but this is really a critical position. And when you get a position like this, when tactics are flying on, you really have to take a time out to calculate. Calculation, I mean, a lot of people have said, I think maybe Tartakova, chess is 99% calculation. No matter how you set your pieces up, it's the person who calculates best who's generally going to win the game of chess. So you have to train yourself up in the formulation of calculating correctly. And I'll give you a couple of tips how you can do this. Puzzles are a great way. I had a great book when I was a kid. I used to love having baths. I wasn't a shower person, I was a bath person. I had a puzzle book. I took my puzzle book in the bath, relaxed in the bath for 10 or 20 minutes and tried to solve a couple of puzzles. And this actually improved my tactics immensely. So I recommend maybe spending, if you really want to improve at chess, half an hour a day looking at puzzles and increasing the difficultyness of your puzzles to try to sharpen up your tactics. You also get used to patterns then and how tactics arise. I mean, generally tactical players are trained up in the use of tactics. You can do this by looking at tactics. It's very simple. You can get a number of good tactics books out there. I've done some myself. You can find for publication. And this is a very good way to improve your chess. Tactics, calculation. When you get to a critical point in the game, you really have to try to think of calculating and working out if it's better. Process of elimination, another key concept. In a position like this, you have to work out if this is good for black or not. I'm not going to go too deeply into the lines here because I think that will just bore you. It's crash test chess, so it's in your face, so we're not going to go too immensely into calculating. That's your job at home. But really, for the process of elimination, if you get to this position, you find out it's bad for black, then you have to move on to the next possibility and see if there's any other possibilities rather than bishop to e5. So you can eliminate your bad moves and get to the good moves through the process of elimination and calculation. Key concepts you have to learn. Anyway, Korchnoi decided not to play this move a3, and he played the rather passive knight to c3. And immediately after this move, I was able to grab the initiative. This is a passive retreat, and this is something, it also frees my bishop on f5. So now again, it's very simple, my play here. I'm looking at what pieces are not taking part in the battle. My queen's not doing anything, my rook's not doing anything. What open lines do I have? The open c file, e file, f file. Where do I like to place my pieces? Well, I noticed just by looking at the position, white's king is slightly weakened on the dark squares because his f pawn is gone. It creates a hole in g3. So I thought, well, I should really be moving my queen, not on the c file, which is now actually blocked up, but on the e file. So logical move, queen to e7, continuing, well, wanting to continue with rook to e8. And I've taken the initiative here. I'm already slightly better in this position. So queen to e7. And again, Korchnoi played a rather passive move, rook to f3. So he's going on defensive here, which I was very happy about. So my last piece came into the game. My rook on a8, rook to e8. All my moves have been very natural so far. My Korchnoi now played knight to g4, so the knight's jumping in, attacking h6. But I now did another kick move, h5, kick this knight away from the g4 square, so the knight has to retreat. One lovely idea here actually is if knight to h6, which I was kind of hoping for, well, this does attack my bishop on f5, but the knight looks very silly here. Well, I was actually planning to continue with queen takes e3 check now, which is a very interesting sacrifice. After rook takes e3, I was now going to go bishop takes h6, and I'm going to win this rook on e3 because of the pin against the queen, and I have moves like knight to c2 coming in. Let's just have a look at all my pieces. Rook on e8, very good. All my pieces are active, so this has to be extremely good compensation, if not a winning position for black. So obviously Korchnoi saw this idea, and he didn't let me play this, so he played instead knight to f2. But his moves now, as we've seen, he's been pushed back a little bit, so I'm given a chance to gain the initiative. Another bit of advice here, which I'll give to you: if you have the initiative, then don't let it slip. If you have the initiative, you have the attack, you've always got to look for the most active continuation. As soon as you start playing passively, you're going to lose the initiative. Your opponent's going to gain the initiative, and you're going to lose all the advantage you have. So here, I've got to look at active solutions. What pieces are not doing much? How can I attack? Always look for threats you can create. The more threats you create, the harder you make it for your opponent to defend. Crash test chess. Create threats, give your opponent as many difficulties as you can, and he's going to crack up. That is the whole point behind crash test chess. So knight to c2 is played, attacking the bishop on e3 and moving forwards. Forwards, men. This bishop has to move. Bishop to f4. But now, really, the position is starting to collapse for white here. As I noted before, the pawn on f2 is gone. It's created some weaknesses on the king's side. Which pieces are not doing anything? Very logical thinking. My queen and rook very well placed. Bishop on f5, knight on c2, very good. So how can we increase the pressure? Bishop to d4. Another piece comes to a very active square, creating a pin on the knight on f2. So all my pieces are now active. White's piece is slightly passive, and the game comes to a natural conclusion now, just because of the positioning of my pieces. And it all started from this rather passive move that Korchnoi played, knight to c3. If your opponent plays a passive move, always look at ways to take advantage of that in your face. Active chess. Always look at ways to create difficulties for your opponent. So here, after bishop to d4, Korchnoi moved out of the pin, king to h2. But now I came in with the move queen to e1. And my queen is now starting to infiltrate the position. One point behind this move is if Korchnoi plays queen takes e1, I would play knight takes e1, and Korchnoi is going to lose material and the game. So you can't actually exchange queens here. Generally, when you're attacking, you want to keep the queens on the board, but Korchnoi is not in a position to exchange queens here. So the pressure is building on Korchnoi's position. He tried to break out with g4, so creating a threat against my bishop. If my bishop retreats, Korchnoi would take on c2. Do we retreat in crash chess? See, I told you I was going to get tongue-tied. Well, we don't. We always look for the active solution, and we always look at ways to create threats. We're trying to do that in crash chess. We're trying to go for active, aggressive chess. White's king is very weak now, so we have to look at a way to infiltrate this position even more. And it should be quite logical, the next move. So have a think what we can do here. We don't want to retreat, queen to f1. And really the game now finishes very quickly after this move. Queen to f1 creates a number of ideas. Mainly it frees up the e1 square, even for rook to e1 to be played next. Or knight to e1 is another possibility. And both of these moves are pretty devastating. The game finished, pawn takes f5, so Korchnoi wins the piece. But now I just played knight to e1 and Korchnoi resigned in this position. The problem he has here is that, okay, let's say he plays pawn takes g6 check. Well, I just moved my king somewhere he cannot check me anymore. So let's say king to g8. And the main threat in this position is queen to g2 checkmate. But I always have knight takes f3, which is going to be devastating. If this like rook moves to g3, this looks like maybe one of the only moves he could try. Well, then I expect something like bishop takes f2 is going to win the game quite easily here. And basically I have too many pieces around Korchnoi's king. He can't deal with all the threats. Just look how active all my remaining pieces are. And it all started from this rather slightly passive move, knight to c3. So what lessons can we take away from that game? I mean, actually, it was quite a logical build-up for me. I played reasonably logical moves. I mean, I just developed my pieces to start with, got them active. When the position of pawn structure came stagnant, I looked for pawn breaks. And then I concentrated on the area of the board I thought was strongest, the king side, with f5. And then I just looked at trying to get my pieces in the game, get them to the most active squares. So active chess, cause your opponent as much difficulties as you can, keep the pressure on him, and hopefully he's going to crack. Having the initiative is key, and that's what we're really going to concentrate on in this DVD. Having the initiative, keeping control of the initiative, and hoping your opponent's going to crack under the constant pressure. So I hope you enjoyed that game. We're now going to move on to another game. So cheers.